thought this game was about dragons. What's up, gamers? Today's video is going to be a little bit different than what we've been doing lately on this channel. There's a new Dragon Age game, Dragon Age Veilguard, the Veilguard, something like that, is coming out soon. I've never played a Dragon Age game, but my editor really likes this series. She really wanted me to give it a shot, so that's actually what I did today, just before recording this on stream, was I played that game. And now we're going to try making a, I don't know what we're going to call this, like video game diary entry based on my first blind playthrough of Dragon Age Inquisition. It's my first sort of like foray into this series. I've never played a Dragon Age game before, but I want to give it a try because the new game's coming out. It has a lot of eyes on it, and so yeah, that's what we're going to be doing today. All right, so let's just get into it. Like I mentioned, my exposure to Dragon Age is basically nothing. Actually, that's not true. My exposure to Dragon Age so far has been the trailers for Veilguard that have come out recently, which have, depending on which one we're talking about, have been like of mixed interest to me. I will say, in a weird way, the first thing I'll say about Dragon Age Inquisition that has almost nothing to do with Dragon Age Inquisition is that it's kind of actually piqued my interest a little bit more about Veilguard. But let's get into Inquisition. Let's start talking about that. Let me just give you like a quick rundown of like what we're doing in the story so far, because it's interesting the way that the story is told. Inquisition, from what I've heard, is not the first Dragon Age game. There are, I think, 2 more before it, so I'm kind of jumping in like midway into the series. What's happened so far is there was, I guess, some type of large explosion, catastrophe at some place, and a giant breach, they call it different things. Breach or rift or something was opened that is now spawning demons, right? Very kind of like boilerplate, very basic premise for a fantasy questing story type game. But I will say it's very interesting how that setup kind of, you know, for me as someone who's played video games my whole life, that setup kind of leads me to predict, okay, we're going to go around and we're going to be closing demonic rifts and gathering more power, and then that's how we're gonna, that's the course that the game is gonna go down. And even though I haven't really gotten that far, basically I've gotten through the little intro section that takes you up to the title card, where you close, I think, like the first little demon rift. You gain like the very first introductory members to your party. Afterwards, you go to the hinterlands and you spend some time doing some side questy stuff, setting up some camps, checking in with the Inquisition's scouts. The Inquisition, by the way, is this thing that gets formed after the little intro sequence, where the people who were there, who witnessed, or some of the people who were there, who witnessed the opening of this rift, basically decide, okay, fuck the factions, fuck the other powers that be, we need to form an organization that is solely devoted to tackling the problem here at hand. And I think that's really interesting because, like I was saying, I would kind of expect a game that has a fantasy setting to be, you know, about like magic and enhancing our own magic so that ultimately we can have magic, right? That's kind of like where my head is at. That's where I was coming at this from. What I've noticed, or what the game gets into very quickly, is introducing a bunch of factions that I still, at this point, don't really understand at all, but making it very clear that this game actually is going to be a lot more about, I don't know if I ever want to call it politicking. It's more about like gaining influence in the world. And I think it's interesting because there's a mechanic in the game where you literally build what they call in the game influence, right? You have to build influence to undertake like the next leg of your journey to like take on the next quest, which I think is really, really, really cool. It's the kind of thing that I didn't really expect. I wasn't sure what to expect from this game at all, but I didn't really expect this, and it's got me, I gotta admit, like, it's kind of got its hook in me a little bit because of that, because the characters, I mean, I've played for like less than 4 hours so far, so I haven't had enough time to really like get to know and fall in love with the little characters. Although their characterization, I think, so far is like very strong right up front. But yeah, having said that, I would say that it's definitely put its best foot forward in terms of putting not just like a world-ending threat, but also like a political sort of nightmare that you're going to have to enter. Oh geez, I'm really strongly debating comparing this thing to Game of Thrones just because of how Game of Thrones kind of ended up letting me down.
And you kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet.
It is a little bit of that, right? Like Game of Thrones starts with the threat from the White Walkers being introduced, and you kind of assume that this is going to be like the big focal point of the story, and that's kind of like what Dragon Age so far feels like a little bit. Maybe not the most flattering comparison nowadays, but I will say it similarly takes advantage of that beginning of the story where it introduces like a great threat, but it seems like the gameplay is going to focus a lot more on the interplay between, like, I don't want to call them human factions because there's like different races besides humans. You've got like elves, dwarves, and like some other race I don't even know. I don't even think I've seen yet. But it's interesting that the interactions between not necessarily races, although there is like some sort of weird racial tension in the world, but more like the tension between factions seems like a big focal point of the story, even already right away in the beginning. I would say actually probably a better comparison than Game of Thrones would be Mass Effect, where I had a similar experience with Mass Effect actually. I picked up Mass Effect 2 when I was like in high school or early college or something, and I remember turning that game on, getting in, making my character. Something big happens, the Normandy gets blown up, and you know, shit gets crazy, but not in a way that I personally understood because I hadn't played Mass Effect 1, so I didn't know what that story, you know, all the things that Shepard had gone through at that point. I didn't really understand like the different factions, but I think that Mass Effect 2 did a pretty good job of introducing us in a way that felt pretty natural. And I would say that Dragon Age is kind of similar too, right? It's not like they introduce you to elves and then bring up like, oh yeah, and of course everyone hates elves because of this thing or that thing in the past. It's like, you know, where the exposition's obvious and in your face. This game doesn't do that. This game, I think, does a much better job at sort of like more naturally integrating you into its world. And you know, actually that kind of makes sense because I think these are both BioWare games, right? Mass Effect and Dragon Age, these are both BioWare. Yeah, but speaking of that though, of that comparison, moving away from the story and focusing a little bit more on the gameplay, this is like the other thing. This is the one area where I think I am going to be a little bit more critical, and it's really unfortunate for the game because while I think the story, I mean, the story is a story, right? Like, you don't have to worry too much about like a story aging, I guess, unless, I mean, some stories have aged or whatever, right? Of course, that's true. But I will say that the gameplay, this game, I think it's like 10 years old or something, or at least like it feels like it's 10 years old, and it looks 10 years old, and it just is like a very like 10-year-old game. And it's really unfortunate because I think this game really suffers from reminding me a little bit of two games that I played last year that were really good. Baldur's Gate 3, of course, like this is the fantasy settings there. You have a party, you have decision making and all that kind of stuff. And then also weirdly, this game kind of reminds me a little bit of Final Fantasy 16's combat, except it's like a lot more stripped down. From Final Fantasy 16, you don't start with very many abilities. It's a lot of just like spamming the melee stuff and then like using your abilities when they come up. And that's kind of so far what this game is like, although this game is weird. Like it's kind of like a third-person action game, right? You control a character, your character has basic attack, and then they also have abilities, and as you progress through the game, you can unlock more abilities, right? I haven't really done too much of that yet. Obviously, I've only played for a few hours. And then also the cool thing, I guess, about this game is that you can switch through the members of your party so that you're not locked into just one playstyle. But also, there's sort of another way to play through fights if you want. You can press a button and go into like a top-down, like tactician mode where you direct your units in like almost like an RTS kind of way, which is more reminiscent of a game like Baldur's Gate 3, but doesn't feel anywhere near as fleshed out as that did in terms of its combat, and it leaves me feeling kind of like I actually have pity for this game. Like, it's a 10-year-old game. I'm sure if I played it at the time, I actually would have been like really impressed with it in a lot of ways, and it's really just unfortunate I'm playing it like 10 years after it came out, or however long. I actually don't know how long ago it came out. Jen, put that on the screen, please. Correct me. But this game really just has the misfortune of coming out after other games have sort of done it better. And I think that's like the thing that, you know, through no fault of the developers or anyone who made the game, it's just kind of like, yikes, it's 2024. This isn't like the best gameplay, which is actually really unfortunate because there's so much in this game that does feel really fun and really, it was probably very innovative for the time, right? Like taking on missions from your war room, you know, spending resources so that you can send out like people from the Inquisition to go do missions. That sounds like a really cool thing. It's been done to death now, but from what I can tell so far, that seems like a pretty cool mechanic. I'm gonna have to play a little bit more before I come up with like final thoughts on it, but from what I've seen so far, I like a lot of it. The gameplay feels very dated, as it kind of should, right? It feels weird to like hold that against the game. Like, sorry, you came out 10 years ago. What am I going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? You're just an old game, you know? That being said, I believe the original Dark Souls came out like 10-ish years ago. Mass Effect 2 came out more than 10 years ago. There are old games that have gameplay that holds up. And while I kind of want to be forgiving to Dragon Age Inquisition, I can't really help but remember that, listen, just because you're old, it doesn't mean the gameplay has to be bad. And I'm not saying that the gameplay is bad, it could be better, and I've seen games from that time that have better gameplay. And I think it would have been better for them to maybe have committed more to figuring out what they want to do with the gameplay, right? Like, is it a third-person action game, right? Like a Dark Souls kind of a thing? Or is it meant to be like more of a strategy RPG? Because I remember when Baldur's Gate 3 came out, people were saying, listen guys, if you finished Baldur's Gate 3 already, go back and play the other ones because they still hold up. They're really good. I mean, yeah, that's, you know, there's no reason, like, if they wanted to, why couldn't they have made Dragon Age Inquisition more focused on the strategic RPG side, right? Where, like, you know, maybe it's like turn-based combat. I think that could have been cool, because as it is now, the combat feels like very messy, and just not refined. And it's funny because my friend who helps me do all the editing for videos on my channel, she's, like I said, a huge fan of this series, and she was telling me about how she plays in like the most casual mode that she can do because she doesn't care that much about like the fighting gameplay stuff. She cares more about like the story and the characters and that kind of stuff, which I think that's fine. I totally respect that. And I'm actually kind of leaning towards maybe doing that myself, just because the gameplay does feel kind of messy. But we'll see. We're still early. I have no idea where things are going to go next, but I will say I'm a little bit more excited to get back into playing it next week. I think my plan right now is to block out like 4 to 5 hours every week to play through a chunk of this game, and we'll see how far I get, and kind of we'll try to adjust accordingly. My goal is to be done with Dragon Age Inquisition so that I can make like a big video. Here are my thoughts about Dragon Age Inquisition, and maybe I'm looking forward to this in the Veilguard or Dawnguard or Veilguard, I think, yeah, because I am interested in playing that when it comes out. So if you're interested, then yeah, definitely hit subscribe, do the bell stuff, like this video, help me out, please. Don't worry, by the way, if you're not interested in Dragon Age stuff, we're not done with Final Fantasy stuff at all. We're still going to be doing that. This is just kind of like a new additional thing that I want to bring to the channel, because why not? We're at a good point where we can try out different stuff. I'm not good at outros. Jesus Christ. All right, guys. I love you. Peace. Out.